the point I want to make is that I think there are really two approaches to clear thinking. And it comes down to, that's very cute. What does one attempt, as is now taught in graduate school in effectively every field as far as I can tell, does one attempt to figure out which model is best and then become expert in applying it? Or does one deploy a model and compare its results to the emerging evidence and adjust the model accordingly and move in the direction of better and better models, right? And my claim is going to be that our entire expert class was doing the former thing. It was practiced at a game in which it would identify a model that was claimed to be the best. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but such a model. And then it applied that model. It applied it with great nuance sometimes, but it applied that model and it doubled down on it. And at the point that model turns out to be false, they go down with the ship. And that happened in the space of a very short time span with respect to COVID.
And often shouting about how the ship can't possibly be going down because they were promised, they were assured, they looked into it themselves, the model is right. The model must be right.
And that is the curious thing about this, is if you check in with these people, you do not get what I would ordinarily expect of intellectuals, which is at least grudging acknowledgement that they had taken a position that turned out not to be right. And maybe I would expect amongst the lower quality ones excuse making about how they got suckered by some piece of evidence that mesmerized them when they should have been looking at something else. But instead what you find is a kind of insistence that no, in fact, they were right and they still are. And so that is going to be the red flag. If your position on COVID hasn't changed radically, then your position isn't your position, it's something else, right? It's you deploying a position held by something else. And so anyway, what I'm going to argue, go ahead.
I just want to add in other ways of saying what you're saying whenever it occurs to me. In science, in the kinds of science that we were trained in and engaged in many rooms under many circumstances and in many forests under many circumstances, we were assured that you don't prove a hypothesis correct, that this was, the falsificationist kind of science, sort of Popperian thinking, in which you can work very, very hard to try to falsify an idea, a hypothesis. And if you fail to do that, if you fail to falsify a cherished or not cherished hypothesis after a lot of hard work, you have greater and greater confidence that it is true, but you don't ever completely know that it is true. And so one of the things that I hear you saying here is, and we talked a couple of weeks ago, and I wrote actually a couple of weeks ago in Natural Sections about the nature of certainty. That, are you comfortable with an idea? Oh, other people who I am supposed to trust or I do trust say that thing is correct, therefore that's it. One hypothesis, one thing, that's it, we're done. Every decision I make is based, the decision tree may go on. There may be forks in the future, but that is unchanging. As opposed to, there's a question, there's an observation, there's a set of things going on. What could explain them? I got hypothesis 1, which partially explains this, but doesn't explain that. I got hypothesis 2, which is counter to that because it explains things differently and they predict different things. I've got hypothesis 3, and especially with something as complex as COVID, the landscape of the last 3 years, you don't just have one set of mutually exclusive hypotheses. There's the question of lab leak, there's the question of vaccine safety, the question of vaccine efficacy, of off-label treatments of all of the various sorts that we have, and whether or not they're safe, whether or not they're effective as prophylaxis, as treatment. So lots and lots of different questions. But for all of them, are you keeping multiple possibilities alive in your mind at once, or have you concluded, you know what, this is it? Nope, I will not ever conclude that if it's called a vaccine, it could possibly be anything but safe and effective, for instance.
I think that's very well said, and I would just add to it that one thing that is true is that corrupt science will inherently be verificationist. Right? That falsificationism is incompatible. It's almost impossible to do it well, right? You might pretend to be a falsificationist, but if you look under the hood, you will find verificationism where science has been corrupted. Yeah. But let me just describe the two models, and you will see, I think, why one of them failed so badly with COVID. It always fails, but it failed so badly with COVID.
Great.
The two models are, you pick your model of the universe or a particular subset of the universe, some discipline, how does X thing work? And you apply it as an expert, but you don't question it, right? And the other is you start somewhere and you start working towards a better and better model by adjusting, right? Now, my claim is going to be, I don't actually care where you start. It is better to start closer to the target. Any process in which you actually adjust with response to evidence will eventually take you where you are going, and it will very rapidly surpass the static application of anything but an already excellent model.
Someone employing a self-correcting process who is farther from the truth is someone you would prefer to follow in their thinking, in their conclusions, than someone who is currently closer to the truth of that matter, but is employing a static model.
Right. Now, there is a degree of difference in that if you have a very mature understanding of some set of facts, then the model that somebody adopts wholesale may be pretty good to start with. And so their failure to adjust may not be a big handicap, right? Yeah. But what did we get with COVID? We got a situation where nobody knew anything, right? There were no good models. So the fact that X person's model was 3 times as good as Y person's model had almost nothing to say about whether it ended up better. The question was, are you adjusting your model and improving it, or are you keeping your model static and just applying it? And so what I'm going to claim is that all of the people who failed so spectacularly have not substantially changed their opinions. Now, there will be little cases pointed out where people made little adjustments. By and large, the people who say that the vaccines are safe and effective have not changed their tune. They, in fact, started with that as an assumption, and they now report it as a conclusion. And that this is actually evident, it just so happens that I tangled with both Claire and Sam over this issue before there was COVID. I tangled with them about the question of whether or not vaccines are inherently safe. And my point is, I'm still a big believer in this technology. I still think it's one of the most marvelous success stories of
traditional vaccine
medicine.
technology.
Vaccine technology in principle. However, if vaccines are safe, it is because of a system that prunes the dangerous ones before they get to the public. And we know of multiple failures where vaccines that were not safe got to the public. And we know of many other failures where vaccines didn't get to the public but failed in the testing phase. And what that tells you, if vaccines are sometimes not safe, which we discover in testing, and sometimes not safe, which we discover after they've been released to the public, there's nothing inherently safe about this technology, right? So if vaccines are safe, it can only be because of an excellent system that spots the ones that aren't and keeps them away from you. I know we don't have an excellent system, therefore not safe, right? I'm not saying any individual vaccine is harmful, but I'm saying the idea that they are inherently safe is dead on arrival. And so if you adopted that, especially if you had it prior to COVID and then something was pointed at you and they said, here is a vaccine, safe and effective, and you, of course it's safe and effective, they all are. No, that's wrong. You've already demonstrated that applying your model is going to leave you in the gutter, right?
And it also, you were still going.
No, go ahead.
It also betrays, I think, the hesitation that we saw early in COVID. If you can, remember the spring of 2020. And what we were seeing, at that point, we were just beginning our live streams, and it was, there was a lot of terror, there was confusion, all of this, but overwhelmingly, one of my senses was exhilaration with regard to the scientific literature. Because the scientific literature was open. There were so many people at that point who, as far as I know, almost no one in the very early days was being shut down yet. Very quickly that started to happen. But the preprint servers were just full of papers. And there was so much going on, there was so much research being done, that the voices of authority that decide for you which ones are good and which ones weren't doing the work, right? These hadn't even made it to journals yet, so the peer review process, which is ridiculously broken, wasn't in the way. The editors weren't in the way. The journalists weren't in the way. What you had, if you had if you had the wherewithal and the interest, as we did, to actually wade into the scientific literature as it was being generated day by day in the spring of 2020, it's like, oh my God, there's so much here. And yeah, we can't possibly assess all of it, but how much preferable it is for us, and it should be for anyone, as time-consuming as it is, to go to the source and say, does this make sense? Is this research good? As opposed to, well, I don't have time for that. I'm going to trust this guy who no one had ever heard of before, who happens to run an organization that's under the NIH, who says, no, not that, this, that, and oh, in Fauci we trust. Like, that quickly became the thing that people did because they were scared, they were confused, they didn't know, they wanted someone to look at. And that guy had a conclusion. A few conclusions that we now can be pretty sure almost all of them were not helpful for humanity. And what we were doing, and what many people were doing, but mostly not people who were on your screens, were saying, we don't know, we think this, let's see what is being learned. And that ability to actually look at the scientific literature quickly got polluted. Of course.
Well, it did get polluted. It got captured because, frankly, people were paying attention to what we and others were making of this emerging literature, and it got in the way of whatever. I still don't have any idea what the actual plan of those who enforced their narrative on us was. But the point is, whatever that force was that was enforcing its narrative, whatever its motivation was, it very quickly figured out that it couldn't very well have us discussing the pre-peer-reviewed literature with the public. Oh my goodness, right? That's too dangerous. But I wanted to point out, though, I was thinking about the places that I personally have adjusted my understanding, in some cases radically, in some cases it has actually flipped, it's reversed. And it's a never-ending stream. I spent a couple minutes just thinking this morning about places where I had changed what I understood. Okay. And in fact, I realized that one of our first forays into this, I made a substantial error with respect to my understanding of the science, the actual science, which was, I believed that because we were dealing with an RNA virus, that it transcribed itself into DNA. It reverse transcribed itself and installed itself in the genome, which turns out is not true for coronaviruses.
So just to use one of the pieces of jargon that many people will be familiar with, you thought, and you said on stream, as I remember it, that because it was an RNA virus, it was a retrovirus.
Yeah, and not true, not how they work. So, okay, embarrassing error for me right away, but immediately figured it out and corrected it, right?
Exactly.
All right. I don't know how long I could go listing all of the places where I changed my understanding. Many of them, maybe all of them, I think you share, but nonetheless, I realized my position on the functionality of hydroxychloroquine completely inverted. I believed,
which we never talked about on air because it just didn't even hit radar, really.
This was actually my biggest embarrassment. I do not have a good explanation for how I missed the fact that I was being misled by propaganda on this very useful drug until embarrassingly late. But anyway.
That one was remarkably, that one got us both in a way that most of the, things like 2 weeks to flatten the curve, like a lot of things that a lot of people accepted, like we never believed, but somehow it's a Trump delusion, and it's hydroxychloroquine, And there was a flood of information on all this, but yeah, I bought that.
Yep.
I bought it for a long time.
Yep. Too long.
Yeah, and it's not true.
All right. Ivermectin effectiveness. Now, mind you, effectiveness on two different fronts, both as a treatment for COVID and as a prophylactic. My position on this has changed. It has changed slightly because one paper that appeared to demonstrate extreme effectiveness did not turn out to be what it appeared to be on first pass. I still think the experiment took place. It gave a compelling result. But because the methods section did not provide enough information and the data set when I requested it was not forthcoming.
This is the one out of Argentina?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Carvalho study. Yeah. The experiment is not reproducible. Yeah. And so I said, you have to take this piece of evidence and give it 0 evidentiary weight because it is essential for science to be repeatable. Now, I would make that criticism of many experiments on the other side now, too. But
didn't the Laurie meta-analysis remove it and get very much the same results? Or was that not
that was a different study.
Oh, they removed a different paper. Okay.
Yeah, so because it was not a randomized controlled trial, it wasn't in there in the first place.
Oh, right. Okay.
It's a different study. But yes, and I had Tess on because I wanted people to understand that the fact that you've got a study that turns out to be fraudulent does not invalidate a meta-analysis that included it. In fact, this is one of the strengths of meta-analysis, is that you can simply say, what happens if we exclude this study? What does it do to the result? And the answer was it didn't change it very much. But my position on ivermectin effectiveness has largely changed because ivermectin effectiveness has largely changed.
Because the virus changed, because the virus is mutating as viruses will do, especially with a strong selective force.
Well, strong selective force. Now, this one perplexed me. At first I thought, is it reduced in effectiveness with respect to the later variants because resistance has evolved, which I initially said I didn't think was going to happen.
Yeah.
And apparently that is not what's going on. What's going on is
I feel like what little I understand about ivermectin mechanism of action, it wouldn't be resistance.
Resistance is unlikely because there are multiple mechanisms of action. And so the point is progress against one doesn't substantially alter the fate of the virus in its context.
And it's such a broad spectrum antiparasitic.
Right. So what apparently, my understanding, I think largely from Gerrit van den Bosch, is that what happened is the virus adopted a different strategy in which it produced many, many more copies. And so you had to drive the effective dose of ivermectin way up, which then creates side effects, which are not terrible side effects, but nonetheless, you don't want to be using this as a prophylactic at a dose that it's causing like visual side effects and things like that.
It's not like you don't become a quadruped and start asking for a saddle.